Hey there, leadership enthusiast. Welcome back to another episode of Todd Talk, where we talk about all things leadership, the good, the bad, and yes, even the ugly. I'm Todd Marshall Hearnsberger, and this is where we explore practical strategies to help you become the functional leader that you need to be. So today, I want to share a leadership practice that literally transformed my team culture, and it might do just the same for yours as well. And that's creating judgment-free zones through what I call sharpening the saw meetings. Now, when I implemented these sharpening the saw meetings many years ago in multiple organizations where I served in leadership roles, I didn't know exactly how they would be received, but to my surprise, they were a huge success for me as the leader, for my team members, and also for the organization as a whole. But before I dive into how I implemented these meetings, I want to share the story that inspired this approach and method. There's this powerful parable about two lumberjacks who entered a tree cutting competition. They both needed to cut down as many trees as possible in a single day. Now, the first lumberjack gets right to work immediately. From sunrise to sunset, he is sawing away without having to take a single break. He's sweating, he's exhausted, he keeps pushing through because he's determined to win this contest. Now, the second lumberjack, he takes a different approach. About every hour or so, he stops sawing and disappears for about 10 minutes. Well, the first lumberjack notices this and thinks to himself, well, this is great. There's no way he can beat me if he keeps taking all these breaks. Well, when the day ends and they count the trees, surprisingly, the second lumberjack has cut down significantly more than the first. And the first lumberjack, he is completely shocked and he asks the other lumberjack, how is this possible? I worked nonstop all day long and you kept taking breaks. I don't understand it. Well, the second lumberjack smiled and simply said, listen, it was simple. I was taking breaks to sharpen my saw. You were working harder with a dull blade while I was working smarter with a sharp one. Now, this story really resonates with me because I realize that in leadership, we often get so caught up in the day to day operations that we forget to sharpen our saws relationally with our team members. We're working alongside our team members every day, but how often do we actually get to check in with each other on deeper levels? This is called having emotional intelligence. Being able to read the emotional health of your team by paying attention to their work habits, their attitudes, and even in their general conversations that you overhear. That's why I created what I called Sharpening the Saw meetings with my team. These were annual one on one sessions with each team member that I oversaw throughout the year. But these weren't just typical performance reviews, they were completely different. The key difference was that these meetings were established as a judgment free zone from the start. I made it crystal clear that anything shared in these meetings wouldn't result in any formal consequences or retaliation of any kind. The entire purpose of these meetings was to create a space where both of us can speak openly and honestly about our working relationship and about the organization as a whole. When I first announced these meetings, you could practically hear the eye rolls. Many team members assumed it was just another work exercise that would lead to nowhere. But once they saw I was willing to be honest and open, it helped them to feel safer to open up and share their real feelings with me. The real turning point came after the first year when people realized that what was shared in these meetings, it truly stayed in those meetings. Unless we both agreed something needed to be addressed more formally. But when my team members saw that others had shared concerns without any negative repercussions, then the trust really began to grow. So let me walk you through what one of these meetings actually looked like. I tried to schedule them away from our usual workspace. Sometimes I tried to schedule them in a coffee shop, sometimes in a reserved conference room with comfortable seating. I wanted it to feel different from our regular interactions. I'd always begin by restating the purpose of these meetings. This is a time for us to sharpen our saws together. It's not about performance metrics or meeting goals, but it's about our working relationship and environment between each other. Then I'd usually kick things off with some reflection questions like, what's been energizing you about your work this past year? Or what's been draining you? Or what's one thing about our team culture that you wish you could change? What's one thing I do as a leader that helps you succeed? And what's one thing that I do that creates obstacles for you? Now, as you can imagine, the responses just widely varied. Some people came with pages of notes because they'd been waiting for a chance to share their thoughts for a long time, but others, they were more hesitant and needed encouragement. I remember specifically one team member who had been with us for several years. And in our meeting, they shared that they felt invisible in team discussions. They felt that their ideas were often overlooked or attributed to others. Now, this was something I hadn't noticed at all, but once they pointed it out, I definitely saw the pattern. Another powerful example was a team member who admitted that they were considering leaving because they felt that their skills weren't being utilized. Well, we were able to restructure some of their responsibilities, and about 3 years later, they were still with us, thriving in a role that better matched their talents and their skills. On the flip side, I've also had team members use these meetings to give me feedback about my leadership style. One person shared that my tendency to jump in with solutions was preventing them from developing their own problem-solving skills. Now, that was hard to hear, but it was incredibly valuable feedback that I needed to hear. Receiving direct feedback about my leadership style was challenging for me, but I had to constantly remind myself that the purpose of these meetings was to sharpen both of our saws. If I wanted honest feedback, I needed to model receiving feedback as well. So before each meeting, I'd spend some time reflecting on my own leadership blind spots and areas where I knew that I needed some improvement. Now, this helped me enter the conversation with some humility rather than being defensive in any way. And I also found it helpful to respond to feedback with curiosity rather than trying to justify my actions. Instead of me saying, well, the reason I do this or that is, I tried to ask the question, can you tell me more about how that impacts you? Or do you have suggestions for how I could approach that differently? The changes in our team culture were remarkable. And through all of this, it happened over time. First, we saw improved retention rates. People who might have left out of frustration now had an outlet to address their concerns openly. Communication improved dramatically. Issues that might have festered for months now came to light more quickly because people knew there was space where they could be addressed. Perhaps the most importantly of everything, there was a noticeable increase in psychological safety within the team. People became more willing to take risk, to share their ideas and admit mistakes because they had experienced being heard without judgment. There were some expected benefits of all of this too. These meetings significantly improved my effectiveness as a leader. They gave me insight into the team's needs and perspectives that I wouldn't have gained otherwise. I became more attuned to subtle dynamics, and I was able to address potential issues before they became major problems. Now, as for the challenges, the biggest one was time commitment. As my team grew, setting aside time for meaningful one-on-ones with each person became increasingly difficult for me. But it was always worth it. I had to practice what I preached, taking time to sharpen the saw even when it seemed like I didn't have time. Another challenge was maintaining the boundary between these judgment-free conversations and also with the formal performance management that I had to do. There were times when serious performance issues came up that couldn't be ignored, and navigating that while maintaining trust required careful communication. If you're thinking about implementing something similar with your team, here's some practical advice. First, be clear about your intentions. Explain why you're creating these meetings and what you hope to achieve. Emphasize that this is about building a stronger working relationship, not evaluating performance. Secondly, be patient. Trust takes time to build, especially in organizations where open communication hasn't been the norm. You might not get much honest feedback in the first few rounds of these kinds of meetings, so just be patient. Third, follow through on any commitment you make during these conversations. If someone shares a concern with you and you agree to address it, make sure you do it. Nothing builds trust faster than showing people their words lead to action. Fourth, maintain confidentiality. Unless you have explicit permission to share something that came up in these meetings, don't share it. One breach of trust can undo months of relationship building. Finally, adapt the format to fit your team's needs. Some teams might prefer more structured conversations, while others might want a more open-ended approach. The key is creating that judgment-free space, however you choose to structure it. These Sharpening the Saw meetings have evolved for me over time. Initially, these were strictly annual meetings, but I found that was too infrequent for some of my team members. Eventually, we implemented quarterly check-ins that were less extensive, but maintained the same judgment-free atmosphere. I also incorporated some structured reflection questions that team members received ahead of time of the meeting, which helped them prepare. And I learned to leave more space for silence in these conversations. Sometimes people need time to formulate their thoughts, especially when sharing something so difficult. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds great in theory, but my organization's culture doesn't support this kind of communication. I'd encourage you to start small. You don't need organizational approval to change how you interact with your direct people that you supervise. Even if the broader culture isn't supportive, you can create a microculture within your team. Remember that changing culture happens one conversation at a time. These judgment-free meetings might seem like a small initiative, but they can be the beginning of a significant cultural shift and consider the cost of not creating these spaces. How many good ideas are going unshared? How many talented team members are quietly disengaging or planning their exit? The investment of time in these conversations pay enormous dividends in engagement, innovation, and even retention. Now, as we wrap up today's episode, I think we should come back to the lumberjack story. As leaders, we often get so focused on cutting down trees, the meeting the goals, the solving problems, the driving results, that we forget to sharpen our most important tools, the relationships with the people who make those results possible. Taking time to create judgment-free conversations isn't a distraction from leadership work. It is the leadership work. Just like the lumberjack who took the time to sharpen his saw, ultimately cutting down more trees, the leader who invests in authentic communication ultimately builds a more productive, innovative, and resilient team. Remember this: sometimes the most productive thing you can do is put down your saw and sharpen it. Hey, I want to thank you for joining me today for today's Todd Talk. If you enjoyed what you just heard, be sure to like, follow, subscribe, all those things on my social media platforms, and you will find my handle on all of those to be ToddTalk.Leader. ToddTalk.Leader. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. If you also want to know more information about me or my book that recently came out called The Dysfunctional Leader, you can go right here to this website address, which is ToddMarshallHearnsberger.com, and you will find out all the details and even order it on that website. You can find my book also on Amazon, Kindle, and also on Audible if you want to hear me read it to you. So anyway, thanks again. Go out there and do the right thing as leaders. Be well, think well, do well, and lead well.